true. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But how can you say that I am mad?
In the beginning of the story, the narrator is talking about their madness, their mental illness, as it were, because mental illness was something that was just starting to be explored in Poe's day. He was considered an amateur psychologist for some of the things that he put into his works.
They weren't sure exactly what mental illness was at the time. There are a few different diagnoses: melancholia, mania, monomania, but not really specific and not really sure what was causing them, how to cure them.
What I think is interesting about that story is, especially in the open, it talks about the senses. It talks about feeling and seeing and hearing everything.
The narrator said, I heard many things in heaven and I heard many things in hell. Maybe these voices are talking to her and telling her to do these things.
Poe talks about this. The narrator talks about this at the beginning of the story. I could hear everything. I could see everything, up in heaven, down in hell. There was nothing else that was bothering me except this one thing, and it wouldn't stop until I stopped it.
It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none.
But casting a woman in Telltale, it's true, it's in keeping with this idea of a hired help, a domestic, a professional. That's one of the only things a woman could do then.
Back in 1977, a theorist and professor had written a textbook called The Images of Women in American Literature. Her name was Mary Ann Ferguson, and she was the first one that suggested that the narrator of The Telltale Heart was a woman.
But when you think about the work that was being done at the time and the work that this person was hired to do,
A domestic.
it was a domestic
Yeah.
position. There weren't, except for butlers in very large mansions, there weren't all that many men doing that type of work, so it seemed natural.
Poe was a revolutionary in the aspect of how he viewed women in his writing, and he even encouraged other men of his time to do that.
Well, I mean, every woman that he ever loved had died either of tuberculosis or in childbirth, which was not uncommon, you know. But his relationship with women was so tragic because these are all women that he was very close to.
I feel that Poe as a person was very emotional. I think he felt a lot of pain, and that sharpened his work.
And this I did for 7 long nights. Every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed. And so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye.
And that image, almost pitch black, this darkened room, the old man in bed, and a thin beam of light no wider than a spider's web falls on that old man's vulture eye. And the whole scene is just that tension.
But eventually, it was his eye, the vulture eye.
I love that about the story. And so the caregiver caring for somebody, it's not his fault. It's just this one thing. She just can't shut it out. She cannot stop it. And it's relentless, and it must be put out.
I hate to say this, but I feel like there's almost some humor in it because it builds, and he has no rational reason to want to kill this person except the eye. And it's like, he's really nice, but that eye, I hate that eye.
It's almost like that beam of light is so tense. It's like a string about to be plucked, that like a rubber band stretched out, that everything's building up. Poe looked a lot to the news. He was in the magazine business after all. That's where his stories were being published, and very often his stories were published in the same periodicals that were publishing these true life stories of murder and mayhem. And there's a couple different cases that could have inspired the Telltale Heart.
And Poe had actually written an article about the insanity trial of James Wood, which is a resemblance of what happens in the Telltale Heart.
And Poe was covering it for a magazine, Alexander's Weekly Messenger. So Poe was actually reporting on the case. And in the trial, Wood had murdered his family, but he claimed he was not guilty by reason of insanity.
To have an insanity plea then was pretty much unheard of, because insanity was not a reason for murder.
These emotions that you cannot stop and cannot control, that is such a visceral thing. That's how we imagine mental illness to be, but for mental illness, that's the problem with it. There's no outside comprehension of just how disordered that is, and yet Poe can bring you down to this level and move up through the earth of it.
So a lot of what Poe wrote was about, well, how do we know if he's sane or insane? How do we make that distinction?
So I think he took a mixture of a lot of the psychological aspects and a lot of what was going on in the modern day in the news world, and tied it all together and made it his own.
May I help you?
Yes, madam. There have been reports of a disturbance here.
Screams heard coming from inside. We've been deputed to search the premise.
Certainly, gentlemen. Come right in.
And when the police officers show up at the end of the story, the narrator is treated in a standoffish way, even though the police officers would be at the same social level, the same working class as this servant. They treated the narrator like they didn't exist.
So I think Poe had some kind of sympathy for the people who were the outsiders, who might be considered insane, who didn't really fall in line with the way they were supposed to think.
But I do think that the solitary nature of being an artist lends itself to possibly, I don't use the word madness, but you're always listening just to the voice in your head.
Most of his works came from the personal correspondence he had with his friends, the people he worked with, his family. And he made it relatable to life.
Definitely, I think there's some influence of the news and the culture around Poe that went into the Telltale Heart that's not entirely evidenced when we're reading it from a 21st century perspective, but Poe's readers would have seen it completely differently.
And I think that's why his work has stuck around as long as it has, because it's relatable to everyone, not just women, not just men, but everybody with feelings.